How long does it take to build a garden? About 5 years ago, none of this was here. All of the space that is now filled with beds and this gazebo was nothing but an empty field that I walked across to get an idea of what my future garden would include. And now, all of these years later, this garden is filled with beds and plants and lots of gardening activities. But how did I get here? Join me today as I share with you how I planned and built this garden and what's left to do. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and all those years ago, I chose this house specifically because there was nothing here. It was a blank slate. It was an empty page that I could turn into the garden of my dreams. But I spent a lot of time just walking through this space before I came up with a basic plan of how I was going to lay out the future garden. And then I rented some heavy machinery to basically strip away all of the weeds and to level the ground so that I could get started with the building process. My gazebo is in the exact center of my garden. I know that because I laid it all out and drove some measuring stakes in the ground right here in the very middle. And the rest of the garden has spread out in all directions from the centerpiece, the gazebo. I started small. In the first year, I started with just these 2 beds. And at the end of that first season, I added 2 more. I also built these 2 beds with this garden arch in that first year. In the second year, I added 2 more wooden beds and this long concrete block bed. I also added these metal beds, some long wooden beds, and began filling in the area on either side of my garden arch to include currant bushes, comfrey, asparagus, and my raspberry bed. My first fruit trees went in during that second year as well, so that they could start growing and give me fruit as soon as possible. And last year, this peach tree was loaded with fruit for the first time. In the third year, I built this series of beds, designed so that I could cover the entire space with hailcloth to protect the tomatoes and peppers that were growing here. I also began putting in some perennial plants in this pollinator garden area. And I built this bed over here for my stinging nettle, in addition to adding some small trellises and water features in this area. It was also in that third year that I finally got my greenhouse and built it and put it in this spot. Now, it may sound relatively simple because in just a couple minutes, I've shared with you 3 years worth of effort in this garden. All of that time was spent building this space, putting together these beds, putting together the project time that I needed to allow all of this to happen. And yes, I did it all myself. It was in the 4th year that I finally got my gazebo and put it in place in the middle of my garden. And I spent a lot of time preparing this space, laying these pavers, putting in the bricks, laying out some beds. But it worked relatively easily because all of these plants were actually put in the first and second year. I wanted these fruit bushes to begin growing so that I could get the head start and actually have some fruit. Because I had put those first stakes in and left them in, I knew exactly where all of those plants were going to go and how they were going to fit around my gazebo. In the 5th year, I added some more garden beds to expand my ability to grow. And last year, just before the winter set in, I put all of these posts in place for my secret garden that's going to go here. I'll tell you more about that in just a few minutes. And now, moving into the 6th year, I'm just about to finish this fence behind me. Imagine a series of apple trees growing in front of this fence in a Belgian weave design. And imagine that I'm standing at the entrance to my secret garden, where I can walk through this entrance. And this isn't going to be open. There's going to be another small fence right here. So I'll need to move off to the side. All of this will be fenced in. And in the middle here will be a beautiful water feature with some sitting areas. And I can just sit in this space, secluded from the rest of my garden and enjoying the premium plants that will go in this space. And that's exactly how I build my garden, one piece at a time, with certain projects planned for each gardening year. I come up with an idea of how I want to use the space, like for espaliered Belgian weave apple trees or for a secret garden. And then I plan, design, and build that space to fit with how I want my garden to look. I wanted an area in the middle of my garden where I could just sit and relax and get some shade as I look around the entire garden. Which is why this gazebo needed to be in the exact center. That's what I wanted, that's what I designed, and that's what I built. I wanted to be able to walk out of my house and see this beautiful garden area. And then depending on what I needed to do to work in the garden or to enjoy the garden, to branch off, like between these 2 stone beds that I built last year that lead me through the entrance into my pollinator garden. Now, when all of these plants are growing and flowering, this is a beautiful space to just come and enjoy the birds and the insects, and the smells and the colors, everything that makes this space so wonderful. If I don't turn, if I continue forward, that leads me through my grand arch into the main gardening area. And then once I get to this area, I have a choice as well. I like having choices in the garden. So I can turn left and go to the greenhouse, to my raspberries, maybe go forward into the gazebo or into my secret garden, or turn right, go into my vegetable garden area. I treat my garden design and my garden planning to give me those kind of choices, to have all of these different types of rooms in a garden, with each room having a different purpose, a different feel, different plants, and also different effort to make it successful. While the basic design and plan is in place, it is changeable and I can modify it. You may be wondering about this small wooden fencing that I have in place now. Well, I have this here for a couple reasons. As my dogs Mala and Lika run through this area, they like to cut corners. They run through my plants, over my plants, in this area right here. So I want to put a barrier. Now, right now, short term, I have the fence to keep them from cutting the corners. But really, I put this fence in to help me visualize what goes in next. I want to put in a hedge of yew plants, like this one here. I've been propagating cuttings from that yew to put in this spot right here, making a hedge of living plants that will block my dogs from running through, but also add a really nice visual element to help separate this pollinator garden from the path. I wanted to put a fence in the backside of my garden here, partly as a little bit of privacy from the neighbors, but also to give me some shade in the garden, to be able to put some plants in place behind this fence. It wasn't until I decided to put the espalier Belgian weave trees in front of it that I figured out exactly where it should go. Because I have this elderberry bush that is going to get much bigger. So I had to anticipate how much bigger it was going to get, and then anticipate the space that I wanted to have in front of a fence with those espalier trees, and turn this into another sitting area right in the middle of the plants. When I measured all that out, this is where the fence needed to go. And it just coincidentally coincided with the edge of my greenhouse. So now there's some symmetry in the garden. The greenhouse edge and the fence edge line up beautifully. I love this building process, and I love the flexibility of thinking about something, putting a couple stakes in the ground, and then waiting for a couple years to figure out just exactly what it's going to look like. I have patience, and that's the way I garden. With every structure that I put in place, it's not just the building and not just the structure. I'm also designing the plants to go in or near those structures as part of that initial plan. It's like how I approached these metal beds. I put these metal trough beds in the garden in the second year to separate my vegetable garden from my arch garden. And I painted them a light green. And then moving into the third year, I decided to extend this concept with these metal beds that separate my vegetable garden from my gazebo garden, also in a light green color. And now this year, I moved my other green metal bed in the same line of road metal beds to kind of act as an anchor point to the edge of this garden area that leads to my mini orchard. You can kind of see how my gardening brain works. I knew I needed these areas to be separated because I like the individual rooms within my garden. But it wasn't until I put these metal beds behind me in place that the plan really started coming together, and I figured out just exactly how I was going to do it. I knew I wanted some long-lasting beds, so I put the bricks together to make this bed, and then the edging also needed to match the basic design, and I decided to use bricks here first, but I wasn't sure about it. So I built this one edge first to see how I liked it. And then I just laid out the loose bricks until I decided that yes, this is what I wanted. And with that determination made, it's time to get to work. So this year, that's one of my projects, is to finish laying the bricks around my gazebo bed area so that I can delineate where all of these beds are and put in more plants. I knew I wanted to put a hedge here a few years ago, but it wasn't until I put this fencing in place that I realized I'm going to have space behind these stone beds, but also in front of these stone beds. So now what I've done is laid out a temporary path These aren't the final edges. It's just to give me an idea of what it will look like if I turn this area into another flower bed, not part of my original plan, and then extend it underneath the arch. So I can put some vining plants in the ground in front of this bed instead of some of the vining plants that I have growing inside the bed. For me, the design and the building go hand in hand. I can't do one without the other. I can start with the basic design, but it isn't until I start the basic build that I see if that initial design was appropriate or if it needs to be modified. And by putting something like a log in place or some scrap pieces of stone, I can get that feel over a period of time before I actually start the build so that I don't waste too much effort. Like this area with this new fence. I'd originally planned to have a second fence on the other side here, lined up with it. When I take a look at it, I think it makes more sense to have a fence that's offset, that actually lines up with the corner of the house. So to anticipate what that might look like, I have some boards laid out in this area. I'll probably let them sit here for a few months while I decide just exactly how it should line up and what kind of fence it should be. Not all of the garden building needs to be these big major projects like building gazebos and building beds and building fences. Sometimes it's something simple, like what the pathway is going to look like. I made these stepping stones, and I've put a few of them in place just to see if this is what I'm really looking for. Should I continue putting stepping stones throughout the rest of this pathway as it leads to the back of this fence? Because as this fence is here now, I realize that the natural tendency is to actually turn before the fence to get to the greenhouse. I'm not sure if I want the pathway to extend towards the greenhouse here, or if I want the pathway to go behind the fence. So by laying things out and then trying it out, it gives me a much better feel for what the end result is going to look like and how well it's going to work. And while I have the basic design in mind for this secret garden here, I'm going to build the fencing first and then let it sit as I walk inside it and start thinking about what plants are going to be in here. So in the 6th year of this garden build, the fence goes in. It won't be until next year, in the 7th year, that I'll have the water feature and the plants that will fill this space. Most gardeners understand that there's always a new plant to put in. There's something else to try every single year. And when you find your favorite things, you tend to focus on those. For me, the building is part of that process. There's always a new project to try. There's always something new to add to the garden. And once I find that basic idea that I like, it's time to add more of that element in my garden. When will my garden be built completely? Probably never, because I love this process of developing the new ideas based on the plants that I want to put in the garden. And to build something with those plants in mind and then discover that there are other plants that will work well in that area. And it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. I'm lucky that I've got the space to do this, but the same basic concept can be done in much smaller spaces. Start off with just a little bit and then add a little bit more in the next year and the next year and the next year. And before you know it, you've got a garden filled with structures, filled with plants, and filled with excitement, enthusiasm, and enjoyment, of course. If you want to see more about how I've planned this garden and built this garden, start with one of these videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.